Okay, so stewardship. This was a really big topic, and if you guys, oh, I'll put the notes in the chat too. I don't know if we'll get to everything, but I guess for me, like how I started the readings is I was looking at traditional notions of stewardship. So for me, coming from like a religious background, that's first uh, exposure I got to the idea of stewardship through like Catholic upbringing, which is why I kind of started with this like Christian pastor thing, which I really like. Just like if you guys took the time to listen to it, he's a really great like speaker. But I moved through onto like stuff that kind of like prayers for done by this tribe that the Kelsey's tribe from this book that she shared last time. I thought that was nice to share, and then went into land stewardship from this book called Tending the Wild about Native California tribes. And so I guess I wanted to start by just asking people, like, before we talk about data stewardship, like, like, how would people define stewardship itself, starting there, or and also like, where did they, where did you get those ideas from? Like, how has it evolved over time? And feel free to raise a hand. Yeah, Eric.
Uh, so for me, stewardship involves taking care of something so that others may benefit from it. And that's just a really quick definition to raise the issue of notes and taking notes. So I can take notes so that we will ensure this conversation.
Steward this meeting.
Actually, because like the pool of people is small and the notes like take up so much brain space. Kelsey and I, we've usually just gone back over recordings and can take notes. So keep people present. I would be happy to steward the notes after, so don't have to worry about it, and we can just talk.
Okay, so I'm not going to take notes.
Yeah.
No, okay.
Don't worry about it.
Okay.
B5.
That's interesting. Like the word stewardship was not a part of my life before data rescue, like period. And so for me, like if I'm being totally honest, a steward is pretty close, is a librarian, is an archivist of some kind, somebody with knowledge of library science. And what I find that interesting. Like I find the notion that like I was introduced to the notion of stewardship through library science, through people who had very serious views on taxonomies, on metadata, on and on filing systems, and like and so to me, what a steward is somebody who like it's a profession. I am a professional steward. I'm hoping you can hear in my voice that I really want this to fall apart very fast, but but I think that that's sort of very much what I want to just be honest about the way that I conceive of the word steward these days. And for me, it's somebody who has an understanding or an intimate knowledge of library science and says, I can steward this. I can, it has a deep relationship to the notion of availability, right? Somebody who can keep something accessible and available for a long time. And usually that relationship is very tightly coupled. When someone who is stewarding something is taking on a very serious commitment. It's very, it's a very real responsibility to be a steward of an artifact.
So I'm curious, like, so the first couple of readings that had nothing to do with like library science or data, like how did you respond to them?
I totally have to cop to this. I've been so busy running a company that I haven't had time to do the readings. I'm so sorry, Kevin. I love you to bits. I just, I can't pretend I didn't pretend I read it.
No worries. You should try to advance through the notes.
I've literally been doing that. I'm like speeding through all of them.
Also, just to say it, I think for you, Brendan, in terms of like 2 of the readings, I think are super directly applicable to your work. So you should definitely read those regardless. Which is the long-term ecological research one, the first one, not the optional one, and the post-custodial archives paper, not the definition.
Thank you so much. And I have done the readings in the posts in the past, so this is really appreciated, particularly the scoping. I'm sorry, everybody. I'm a bad attendee.
No, I'm glad that you're here.
I've only glanced over the notes myself, so I think I only had like a week to read though, and my life kind of fell apart in that week, so I didn't have time. But next time, I'll have more preparation.
Oh, no, but then, I mean, the question still stands.
Yeah, so stewardship is a pretty new concept to me. Like, I definitely don't have any cultural knowledge of stewardship, and definitely no, like, personal experiences of it. But one interesting use I found of the word was a person in the IRC, Fleeky. He's putting together like a network of like not really, kind of like communes, but not really communes, where nomads will like come and do some sort of thing with a given focus and then go somewhere else. And so there's going to be like a stream of nomads coming and going. It's kind of like a landing spot, but there's also people living there that are the stewards of the lands that kind of like help, keep it maintained, and the people coming in like help them last. So it's like stewardship there is they're kind of there taking care of it so that other people can use it, and also kind of like helping coordinate people. So that was very interesting to me. Just the concept that could be like a role of a person in life is really cool.
Mauve, is that a novel or is that a thing that's real? I missed that part.
That's a thing that's real. That's a thing a person is putting together in the DAT community. Like their family is like they bought some land, like they pulled it together and they're creating like a circus commune. And the hope is to make it one of like a network of these hubs for.
Wow, that's extremely cool.
Yeah.
Is there a link that we can look at for that?
I don't know. I will ask. There is a link, but I don't know if it's like super public or if it's like a work in progress or what. But I'll make sure to ask and get in touch with y'all. Maybe I'll post in the Slack.
Thanks, that's really cool.
Kelsey, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. I guess I usually have heard the stewardship term in two contexts, and one of them is Montessori, and it's usually about stewarding a space. There's this really cool thing that Montessori elementary classrooms do where everybody has a chore that they do every day, and there's a time reserved for it at the end of the day, and maybe it's just dusting the computer monitors, and maybe it's making sure that something's rolled up and put away or whatever. So that's a space stewardship, which is a really cool like interaction and ownership over a space, which means that no cleaners are coming, right? Like this is your space and you need to take care of it. The other context I've mostly heard it in is land stewardship. And this is kind of interesting. Like my dad spent his whole career in timber and timber sales, but it's kind of a dual part thing where like they are in some cases clear cutting Alaskan forests, but he's always worked for the tribal entities. There's a bunch of tribal corporations, and I won't go into it now because it's like a long story. But the job he ended up in like a decade ago was in stewardship of a particular island which had a monoculture of spruce. And spruce take 100 years to mature. So a lot of trees you can harvest in 10 years, but not spruce. Spruce is like a really valuable long-term tree. He had to make these plans that involved accounting for the entire livelihood, but also economic and spiritual and recreational pursuits of the tribal owners who are shareholders of this organization, which is like how Alaska Native claims settled out in perpetuity. And so he had to start making these 100-year plans for land stewardship. And I just think that's a really cool, like, weird mission statement. I think about stewardship kind of as in opposition. By the way, interrupt me if you can't hear me.
You good?
It's interesting to think about like the importance when I look at climate change stuff. It's really interesting to think about the importance of place, the importance of understanding the land and stewarding it over time versus nomadcy, which is very much how I have been living my life, but with strong attachment to place. Move's land stewards coupled with circus, like nomadic people thing is really interesting to me, is because I think they can go together as long as there's someone with.
What was the last thing, Kelsey?
The importance of intergenerational persistence, or at least the passing of knowledge as you leave a place.
Yeah. Eric, did I see your hand earlier? Have a comment?
Yeah, I really appreciated those observations and reflections, Kelsey. For me too, land stewardship is often what I think of when I think of stewardship, not necessarily because I have a direct engagement with land stewardship, although my partner's family, they run a farm that's been in their family for, a long time. And yeah, there's lots to get in there. But you raised the issue, Kelsey, of ownership, which I just think is so interesting when it comes to stewardship, because yeah, I mean, the idea here is that as a steward, you don't actually, a steward is not an owner, as the pastor says. A steward is taking care of somebody else's stuff. You're using somebody else's stuff. And I just think that, just to reflect on the reading, the pastor's comments, I felt were shockingly insightful. I wasn't necessarily expecting something so straightforward in a sermon, but they really helped for me define different dimensions of stewardship in terms of ownership, accountability, responsibility, authority, all these things that go into taking care of somebody else's stuff for them in relation to others who are, potentially using it. So there's a lot going on here. I thought it was a great selection.
Yeah, I guess I would sort of echo a lot of that. And to answer the original question directly, I think the section that we were supposed to listen to out of the sermon was 100% for, I think, how I have like traditionally conceptualized it. That sense of like taking care of and being responsible for somebody else's stuff. And I think there's also something intergenerational, like going back to the memory thing. Like on my dad's side of the family, there's a lot of sense of like passing things down through the family and understanding family history, regardless of whether it's super special or just special to us. That there's not like at all on my mom's side of the family, which is always a very interesting like contrast to see. But thinking of the number of things that either my parents have that I grew up with, or that have already been given to me, or especially in the last year, because my grandmother died last year, and so there was this long process of my dad and his brothers and sisters like splitting up that stuff, and trying to think through like what needs continued custodianship in the family, and who in the family can provide that, which is a whole interesting perspective on it, I think, and has to do a lot with sort of there's this sense of like, even though the person who this was originally meaningful to like no longer is around, and it's you're not like stewarding it society or something, but there's some sort of important sense of like, well, I have this table and it's important that I continue to have this table, because it's important. you know, or this chest or whatever. And so like I think about that a lot also, especially like in the sense of intergenerational stuff. So I guess those are like some of the things I think about a lot when I think about stewardship.
I like that people touched on the idea of ownership. I was chatting with somebody, my neighbor, who's a Episcopalian like pastor. It's like, what's like, you must know a lot about stewardship, and then the thing that this like quick term that they said was like, it's the antidote to dominion. The idea that like, as opposed to we are lording over things or we control things, instead we are stewards. We take care of things, the proper care and use of things, which is kind of the theme I want to kind of touch on next, because I liked within the Tending the Wild reading. I would just read a quote. She says, "One gains respect for nature by using it judiciously, using a plant or an animal, interacting it where it lives, and tying your well-being to its existence. You can be intimate with it and understand it. That's like how you take care of it." And similarly, from the LTER, the long-term research paper, they talked about how like for the scientists in the field, like actually like taking notes and being able to like correct the notes and like real like putting like viscerally putting in the data and dealing with the data gave the scientists like a sense of data and how to relate to it, the context of the data, as opposed to like just numbers in the spreadsheet. And so to go along with that idea, I'm curious like people's thoughts on like one like how do we interact with data on a more visceral level, but like two, like how do we get like the public, like the people that we're trying to reach with like our technology, like how do we get them to use data in a way that they will actually like want to steward it? Because right now like people like you hear about Cambridge Analytica and like they did something to my data, but like I don't know what that data is and I don't use that data on a daily basis, so like I don't even care, and like how do I make money off of my data? Like so I'm curious like what people thoughts on like how do we actually like use this data that we're trying to steward in the sense that like that makes us want to steward it more, and like everybody else around us. Ooh, Mo first and then B5, and I think Eric too.
So I think one example, or is my air conditioner loud?
No.
Okay, great. I think one really cool thing is when they're stewarding it without even really thinking about it. So Secure Scuttlebutt is amazing in that everyone acts as a steward for their friends and the friends of their friends, and it's just completely organic. You don't have to explicitly opt into like storing the data or even thinking about data. It's more like I use this data because it is like the digital aspect of my social life. And by using it, I am stewarding it or something. And I really like this kind of like behind the scenes, just like making it part of the actual process where, more transactional places where it's like, I am the owner of the data. I am the like company that, and Facebook or whatever else. And then you gain access to it through my stewardship. Whereas SSB, it's really like people create their data and then they share it with each other directly as they use it. And I think that's really powerful. So I think that's a way we could go forward. How to actually get there, that's like a whole other thing. But I think if I can just keep ranting, I think large groups of data are bad for this sort of thing. Because like when you have just this one ginormous data set, it becomes so much harder to take care of it. Like the logistics are really hard. And at that point, it's not really a person-to-person level. It's not a family level. You basically have to have these higher level organizations. Like the scientific data from the Large Hadron Collider, you're not going to have like people stewarding it. But it isn't also people data, so that's probably okay. yeah, but large data hard to steward, and people could steward data as a function of using it.
I think it's really, really elegant. And yeah, I like I think to try and build upon that from the reading that I'm doing as we're sitting here, this post-custodial archiving for the collective good, there's this line that just jumped off the page. It's like, the continuous custodianship of material objects can no longer be the focus of archival practice, but it becomes necessary to shift what was traditionally considered archival labor onto record creators. I thought that was like such an interesting, like, if we're thinking post-custodial sort of like archiving, SSB seems to have that and seems to sort of push that labor down into the protocol level, right? By automating dissemination of data and just saying, cool, we're by virtue of viewing this, you're actually seeding this, which is this like lovely sort of mechanism. I think that comes with some complications, and particularly, and I'm not surprised to hear that the follow-on conversation of that be a direct reference to scale, right? Because I think a lot of these patterns really work when we're not taking up all of users' hard drives, or we're not dealing in like, or we're not, but that I specifically want to point to when we're not violating a user's expectations, right? Somebody's participation in a network and sort of their becoming of a seeder is great up until that moment when they're like, wait, this thing that I downloaded put all this data that I don't care about all of a sudden onto my computer. And it's like, oh, shoot. and I think that's part of where we have this sociological relationship to our data. And it's the thing that is the hardest aspect of this to sort of remedy, because it's the thing that requires us to sort of stop everybody and say, hey, you know, you are upset by Cambridge Analytica. You're upset by somebody aggregating your information in ways that you disagree with. Many of the remedies will involve a conversation that you probably didn't want to have before. and so like, how do we sort of like negotiate that aspect? And I think that it's really like, and I think that sort of like shifting labor is like a very real word, right? We're moving work onto people who weren't doing work before. And I think it's really important when we're thinking about stewardship of this information. That's really what we're fundamentally talking about, right? When we decentralize something, we're pushing the burden of keeping that thing available and online, and we're turning everybody who used to be a thin client into a steward, right? If we look at Paul Frazie's sort of thick thinning conversation from prior readings, we're now like saying, cool, you have new responsibilities, right? And it's hard to change the rules of the game now when the internet sort of works the way that it does, and everyone's just been kind of freeloading, and we've sort of grafted on this revenue model that is often based on like treating that same data that people are creating as a kind of labor that can be monetized. I think that's like I think that feels like the central pain of decentralization pains, and it really does feel like one of stewardship, of like, all of a sudden somebody became a steward overnight and they didn't realize it. And like, how do we sort of have that conversation in a meaningful way that allows somebody to see the value of taking the SSB road, right?
So I guess I have a couple thoughts that are like maybe in line with that, maybe counter thoughts. And like my first one, I have a little bit of a like immediate reaction to the idea of like pushing that concept of stewardship sort of like down into the protocol, which is that like I think that's a good from the perspective that it makes it really easy to do. Like it makes it a core part of what's happening. Like I think that's really good. But I worry about the ways in which that could hide it from sort of conscious consideration. Because I think the counterpoint in here is that like part of what's really important is that in a like equitable society or whatever, like this should be a thing that you're always consciously thinking about, which is also, I think, points a little bit to what you were saying, Brendan, about this being like a new point of consideration in these technologies. That is sort of like a big part of the thing that is different in distributed web stuff, right? Is that like where things live is something you should actually be thinking about now, in the sense that like it only exists if it's well stewarded by multiple people, you know? And that bears like real thinking about. to some degree, like, I think it's critical that if we have systems we want to work well, that gets surfaced here somehow, right? And this, I like can't criticize good or bad or anything about Scuttlebutt because I keep meaning to read up on the protocol and haven't right? And so to the degree that that's something that is accomplished by like, oh, you sort of declare this person as a peer, friend, or whatever, and so you're also stewarding their data, then that's like a good thing because it does make it a conscious decision. But to the degree that it just sort of like magically happens for people that you're physically around, maybe it's less a good thing. So like I think that's a really interesting part of all this. And then the other sort of maybe counterpoint I wanted to make is that I think the concerning issue isn't really so much scale as it is scope. And the part that is about scale is more about like commensurate scale. Because I think you were right, Mo, that you know, like we shouldn't, it's not feasible to expect, you know, you or me or individual users to sort of also be stewards of, you know, like the Large Hadron Collider's data. But like institutions like the Large Hadron Collider have the same sort of needs of, you know, co-work and co-stewardship with others. It's just that the institutions that will be able to support that have to also be able to work at commensurate scale. But the flip side is like, I think the thing that is the concerning part or to pay attention to is like scope and breadth, right? Like what we should be avoiding, and I think what you were really getting at is intentional communities that we can think consciously about who we're stewarding for and communicating with. So the problem is like the Google that stores 5 billion users' data as opposed to, you know, the community of 1,000 people that are storing each other's data, but we're even smaller, 10 people. But maybe it's a lot of data for each of those people, but that's fine because it's a scope that we can make meaningful decisions about, as opposed to a scale problem. At least that's what I'm thinking in my head.
Anybody have a response? I just making space so people can talk to each other. But if not, I'm like staring at this quote, and it's like that's also the kind of where it says like pushing forward with automated approaches presents a potential danger of marginalizing other approaches. So this idea of like making it invisible, and I just joined SSB like, you know, after DWeb Camp, and it's interesting to learn. But the first question I asked was like, how much like data is this taking up on my hard drive? Because I didn't know. And I asked Sel, he's like a developer on SSB. I was like, on average, when I add a person, how much does it add? And he like couldn't answer that. He's like, wow, that's a good question. And so what I've seen though, because I kept on checking it, he showed me how to do it on the terminal. It's like I started at like 200 megs, and then like I'm following like maybe like 30 people now. And now it's like 1.5 gigs. And I'm just like, how did I get here? And the thing that like got to me was like he was showing me like patch through like the other clients with SSB. Is like with the protocol you can have so many different clients and pass the same information around. That's cool. And you know, he was showing like this really lightweight client that he said that can be used in a lot more places. But then I was thinking about like, if you're taking up that much data and you're not like showing people that in whatever way, yeah, like, you know, that's not, you're not thinking about like all the use cases. If somebody has like, you know, I think there's many versus the mobile app, and I'm not sure if it does the same thing with the data, like if it downloads that same amount, but like I've had to like struggle with like gigs here and there on my phone, you know, and so I don't know, that like invisibleness scares me.
That also, if I can jump in, like really makes me think of I mean, I haven't done a whole lot of questionably legal torrenting in a long time, but like for a while when that was the way to get stuff, that a lot of sites had a big focus on tracking how much you were seeding versus how much you were downloading. In that sense of like you had to keep that ratio in check in order to like be able to continue to participate in that community.
Eric?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating conversation, and you know, I'm not sure how much I have to add from the data into things, but you know, I think the basic idea of trying to develop systems in which the actual use equals the stewardship, I think is a really important point. It's good to hear of actual examples out there where that's the idea, because that is, you know, this reading we did on tending the wild, that's one of the things that really struck me, right, is that we often think of stewardship as taking care, which often implies don't touch it, don't use it, anything like that. This is making the exact opposite point, which is that in order for something to actually be stewarded for the future, it has to be used, right? Particular environments, ecosystems, in California in this example, actually require use to persist over time in the way that they, to look like they do now or like they did. So yeah, this question of use is so important, and it, yeah, maybe differs from other sorts of things like, you know, your grandmother's table or something like that, where maybe it's, the stewardship does not involve use, but it sounds like maybe maybe a lot of data actually is we can tie those two things together, although maybe there's data where those two things are still separate. But the kind of this question I think we're really wrestling with around, it seems like a question of incentives and how to get people invested and involved in stewardship in a decentralized fashion. I think from the reading, Kevin, I think you read that quote around tying one's own well-being into the resource that you were stewarding. That really resonated with me, and I think that comes back to this question of incentives and how might, you know, incentives aren't necessarily monetary, but yeah, how do you incentivize people to participate in stewardship? So how do you get them to see that their own well-being in one form or another is involved in the care of this data or whatever we're talking about? And one of the points that's made in this reading, Tending the Wild, and there are problems with directly transporting like indigenous care of the land into stewardship of data. Like that's, you know, we want to be careful there, but the author in the coda makes the point that a lot of this is not just like, how do you, like the technical, like how do you manage a resource? Like how do you, when do you, you know, start a fire and to help plants regrow and that sort of thing, but like affecting changes in values, beliefs, and behavior. And so much of it comes back to like cultural rules and, you know, in this case, different kinds of events that, you know, illustrated the importance of stewardship and of the resource in question, social structures. So yeah, you know, that's pretty abstract, but you know, I think there's so much more to say again around incentives and the role of values, developing a certain value, belief, behavior system around data stewardship. Now that, as Brendan says, people are finding themselves as stewards, and how do you do that? So anyway, really, I thought really provocative reading.
Go ahead.
Kelsey, did you want to jump on Stack? You can't chat.
I would love to at some point.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Oh, cool. I've had a lot of thoughts floating around, and I'm like writing them down in my offline space right now. But I want to directly address what Eric was talking about in terms of incentivization, and I was hoping that would come up. there's something that I've just been reading over the last couple of days called Ink and Switch, You Own Your Data in Spite of the Cloud. And one of the things that it talks about is the value of offline first apps to the user. And I feel like that could be a hint for how we make this transition something that makes people feel like doing it. Clumsily phrased. But it talks about, for example, how programmers have been very resistant to the idea of IDEs existing in a cloud app environment. They'd much prefer to have them offline. And if you ask why, it's because, well, you want it local, or because you want to have the ability to work on it while you're offline, or because you want to understand the whole file structure and have it right there to work with, or because it's faster. And the point that's made in this post is that that's not stuff that is unique to programmers. So why is everybody okay with cloud native infrastructures in general? Why aren't we building offline first things on the whole? And the Ink and Switch, I think, is a research group, and they're looking at CRDTs as a solution, and they've done some experimental like apps exploring this. I really recommend this post. Anyway, that's all I was thinking about with that.
Mind if I comment on that? Yeah, so Ink and Switch is really awesome. Just the term local first software in air quotes has been like revolutionary, because I've been talking like peer-to-peer, decentralization, distributed systems, and it's like, it's very techy. Local first is still pretty techy, but I think it's got more like emotion in it. It's like, I work locally first, but then I also spread out. It's not just fully offline. It's not just fully local. It's not fully cloud. It's local first, and then you spread out to other people. And I really like that. And also, you know, like humble brag, they're using that stuff under the hood. So it's good stuff. But yeah, local first is amazing. And I think another thing to consider that is it's not enough for a lot of people, specifically people that are more well off. Like if you have great internet and great devices, local first software doesn't offer you that much, especially like business people that are like, you know what, whatever, I just want everything in the cloud. I don't want to bother with computers, all that extra cruft. They're not the ones that are going to benefit as much. Like speaking from my past, you know, having access to internet was not something I had, because it's like, if I want to program somewhere that's not at home, like I had to, I like printed out documentation so that I could reference it, because I didn't have internet, or I'd stick to downloading entire websites for offline use so that I could actually do something. Yeah, so, and I think partially it's because, you know, I was like a poor teenager with no data plan, with no like access to a lot of things. And I think there's a lot of people, especially as wealth disparity gets bigger, it's the people on the bottom that have the most use for this, because they're the ones that are going to have the shittier connectivity, and they're the ones that are going to have less say in things. We can tell them, oh, hey, we have stuff that works offline, or hey, if you're like in the same vicinity as your friend, you can collaborate without anything extra, or you don't have to pay a cloud service provider because, you know, there is no cloud service. I think that's like a bigger value add than, say, like a tech bro who has everything. And like, yeah, but I think, just if I can rant about tech bros again, we have kind of like a two-class system in which we have the producers of technology and we have the consumers of technology. And the producers are the ones that are most informed. And that's why all of like the rich tech people working on social media don't give their children phones, you know, or they're the ones that know the peril because they're building it. So educating people about why they should care, since like it'll be very hard, or even empowering them to do something about it is very hard. Like a big point of this decentralization stuff to me is getting rid of servers so that we can lower the barrier to entry. Because right now, if your base minimum is I need to pay DigitalOcean $5 a month for like a tiny little VM, that's already too much, because it assumes, you know, I have a credit card, I have any money every month, and also that I have the tech skills to like muck around in this server. Whereas if we can have higher level building blocks that just use your local device and sharing directly to people, it reduces the number of places where you need like technical expertise. And your technical expertise is more about like just working with your data and actually sharing it with people. Yeah, so that's all I have on that.
Brendan.
Yeah, I think that's like I think the reading group that has sort of resonated with me a bunch as we've been talking about this is actually the civics one, where like I think the reading on civic republicanism sort of challenged a lot of, for me, it was very challenging and very difficult to sort of, and I think has earned a place in this conversation, because sort of if we sort of rewind to some of Eric's comments around like the incentive structure, right? And as soon as my brain hears incentive models, I hear, okay, transaction systems, blockchains, right? And like economics is one interpretation of an incentive model. And then the other one that we're sort of like seeing a bunch, oh, buyer. We're seeing, sorry. I'm sure he's just having a connection problem and not rage quitting. But the other side of it is like, we often sort of hear like, let's do stewardship through dependency, right? Through I rely on this data, therefore I will steward this data, right? Some sort of like graphing onto that. And then there's sort of this like third space that seems to emerge over time of this like, which seems to sort of be the best articulation I've heard of it so far is the sort of civic angle of like, we're sort of articulating a moral duty, right? A moral duty to participate in preservation of this information. And I think that that's something that we should call out and talk about sort of specifically. Like we have sort of economic interpretations, we have dependency-based sort of let's map, I use this, therefore I will steward this automatically. And sort of like, that seems like another bucket that we can really talk about. I think that's very much in the realm of barter systems and like open source sort of thinking. But then I think we have this other bucket that if we look at the classic steward, like this, like, okay, wrong phrase. Classic is somebody who agrees to take care of something. I guess we could loop in like classic steward, like the notion of like somebody in like a religious figure, somebody in a church sort of keeping a text and disseminating a text, or an archivist sort of like agreeing to keep and steward and maintain a collection. All of those things, these folks don't have that, like they aren't explicitly dependent on things, and they feel a duty that is very small, but they often sort of like carry a ton of weight. And I think that that third space is like one of the sort of tougher to talk about, because in our efforts to sort of create a post archival or post steward sort of like universe where we're sort of like wholly in either a blockchain or you know, blockchain folks win and just everything is on chain and my life is significantly more boring, or the like completely open source like zealotry wins and we just do everything by trading sort of, I'll give you my straw hat for my lines of source code. But we sort of still have this like middle space of like, I agree to preserve this purely because it's my job, purely because I have a duty to sort of like participate in this somehow. And I think that's something that we need to sort of talk about more. I think a lot about the Internet Archive. I think a lot about, you know, when Trump's tweets get pulled out from nowhere, like no one thought that it would be important to archive that stuff right up until the moment it's deleted, right? Like I think about like all of these things that aren't valued by society today, but are very much valuable to somebody later. And like, that's where this role is like, it really doesn't fit in these other two buckets. And to me, I think we should really sort of challenge ourselves to ask this question of like, okay, cool. We're trying to articulate to people why they should change their behavior. Along the way, are we actually talking about like digital citizenship and like, should we really be like thinking more broadly about this whole conversation, or is that too much? Or like, I don't know. It's sort of meant to be food for thought more than anything else, because I got nothing.
Okay. Yes. Yes. Also, like, I think that's a great point to slide in the very steering end to the post-custodial piece. That whole last part about from like common good to collective good is very much like fits in, I think, with what you were just saying. I like desperately want the not existing follow-on paper that is more about like what they mean and how they're thinking of collective goods. But there's a whole bit in there that's just sort of like all focused on this sense of like what are our like responsibilities there. The idea that our conceptualization of like common good is now like in the current economic and cultural environment kind of broken and unable to fulfill that, and so they're turning to this idea of collective good, which is a little bit more focus on like how do you choose what those things are that you are responsible for. Like what is the cultural system within which you're working and thinking when you make that choice of the things that people are or aren't, who is or isn't actively saying this is important to me, who are you sort of saving it for, and how do you make those decisions in a like equitable or just way. Because if you just view it as like your conception of the common good, like in what way is that really good enough versus it's just powered by your particular context. And if you're the one with the capability to do that, you're probably also coming from a affluent colonial white context, which is like a really interesting set of points to make, which is why I really want like a follow-on discussion about like, well, how do you determine like what falls into the collective area that you should be responsible for? Because this is like huge deal. But like the other thing that Eric had me thinking of that like also maybe fits in here a little bit is so we were talking about this idea of like, oh, how much space is taken up now that like I have Scuttlebutt client installed and it's taken up by like other people's stuff on my machine. You know, or in any of these approaches where that custodialism is pushed to the edges of the network, as it were, or the producers of the records are also custodians of them. Like in the sense that you want to do that in a community and not just for yourself. So like local first or offline first is just for yourself. And then you grow to the concept of like, okay, in what way does that same set of concepts need to support a community? Which made me think of, like I said before about like all those torrent trackers, and your ratio, you're always shooting for sort of like 1 for 1. Like I'm doing a good job, like downloading the same amount that I'm feeding. But like thinking about that now, and you know the numbers that Kevin was quoting, and I started thinking about it and realizing, oh, if you do want to do this in a community context, your responsibility is to store a lot more of other people's stuff than your own, which is kind of a thing, right? Like how do you provide the structures to make that easy? And the cultural signifiers to make that desirable, and where do like local institutions fit in offloading some of that burden, because that's probably not feasible for everybody, and the way to solve that theoretically, I guess, is like some sort of community institutions that can also do that. How do you have the, like if we're in an IPFS style land, the local community like pinning service? That's not a 4K thing, but it's the thing that we've all agreed on that like pins all of our data so that it is redundantly stored without it taking up, you know, on my disk 100 times the space of my stuff. So I can still use my computer, you know, or so that some of us can go around with the really lightweight clients that don't download a whole lot of other people's stuff, but we're still in some way supporting a community service that does do that work. And so like, I think there's something super interesting there, thinking both about like, if this is important, we have to find ways to support the idea that you're probably, in most cases, and the more theoretically affluent or capable you are, the more of other people's stuff you're storing than your own. But then like, what kinds of community things can or should exist to offload some of that burden? And yeah, so I just think that's like another interesting part of that.
Kelsey, do you have something?
Yeah, I figured out the raise hand feature. No, I think Rob's articulating something that I've been calling in my head the weight of heritage. And I want to like disambiguate. I think there's two forms of stewardship that we're talking about here. And one of them is in the present. It's care in the present of a thing. And that is what Secure Scuttlebutt mostly does. And it's the way it's initially disseminated, the way that a thing reaches its community. And then the second thing, and I think the much harder problem, is the long-term care of a thing, which involves either aggregating infinitely greater amounts of knowledge as time progresses, or pruning it because you have to, and you will in some sense, without, like, things will get lost. And at that point it becomes a question of, well, partially of justice, where we ask the questions of who draws the line, like assuming there is a line, who draws the line and why and for whom. And it becomes really, really interesting because that's one of the things about, say, Facebook. Like, we don't like how Facebook handles our privacy and handles our data and how they, and how they monetize it. On the other hand, you weren't probably planning to keep all the things that Facebook has kept for you and shown you, and like, they do a really good job of showing you things that you had forgotten about, and making you feel the thing again that you felt at that time. And it's fascinating because they've created an incentive structure for themselves to become, in some ways, very good stewards in the long sense, but also very bad stewards in the sense of doing it in the way that people want. So then, how do we manage this weight of like carrying all of the information of our acquaintances, of our past family members, of the place that we're at? Like, how do we make those choices, and how do we make it so that people can make those choices for themselves within the platforms and protocols that we design?
I think, yeah, sorry, is it okay if I speak? I think that an important part of that is to like kind of get rid of even the choice of should I store this or not? Because right now, a big thing is like we have scarcity of storage. Whereas if you don't have scarcity of storage, suddenly it's really not that big of a decision whether I want to keep something or not. It's more of a decision of which things do I want to explicitly purge, I think. And I don't think it's, like, storage is expensive, but it's not that expensive. And I think a lot of it is very artificial. Like, we're getting phones that have 32 gigabytes of storage in like 2019. And by 2019 usage standards, that sucks. But also partially, who does it benefit that our phones do not store a lot? Cloud providers, yay. But also there's, SD cards that can store like terabytes of storage. And how much storage does a user really need at a time? And how hard is it really to have external devices to back it up? Like, I think in terms of technology, there's a lot we can do to kind of get rid of that choice of what should I store or what should I not store. And I think like it's very possible to make it like easier. I don't know. That's kind of some of the thoughts I've been having, because like a lot of the push for thin clients is, I think, because it's to push cloud forward and get like more like physically thin things. But if you make it a little bit thicker, suddenly, a whole bunch of things aren't as big a deal, including storage and dissemination of data, like bandwidth, or even battery. So, yeah. Yeah, that's all I got on that.
It kind of, well, just to ask a clarifying question. It sounds like.
Sorry, would you mind turning up your volume? I can't
Oh yeah,
hear you.
I'll just talk closer to the mic too.
Sorry.
Just a clarifying question, but it sounds like, not the argument, but it's just like, to me, it's like storage is kind of so cheap that like we don't need to make the choice like for everything. What you were, part of what you were saying. Kind of like, back to the SSB thing, which I'm really interested because like the secure scuttlebutt, like you don't like it's not unedible, right? It's immutable. Like once you post something, it stays in the record, and I'm sure there's a lot of thought that went into that. But like for me personally, going onto it, it's, when I think about any of these social media stuff, like I don't want everything to exist forever. I want a choice, even if we could store everything. Like this is like the whole right to be forgotten stuff. It's really interesting, and it's like, you know, we have to ask ourselves like, what is it that we want to like steward, maintain for ourselves? And I don't want like my growing pains and like my silly 20-year-old to be like, you know, like other people's entertainment or just like reason to like. I put in notes just like cancel culture. I don't want like my mistakes to like haunt me forever, like because I can grow. And so I don't know. I like Kelsey also had that like, you know, like what is it that we like choose to keep, and what is, you know, like what is it we choose to like let go of? Here's like people like thoughts on that.
So regarding like deletion, that is a very big question, and not enough people talk about it. I've been trying to talk about it for like a couple of years now in the DApp ecosystem, and I don't think it's crazy hard to do if you have people behaving well. Because when you publish something and it's replicated across the world, you know, that's kind of scary. But what if you had an unpublished button and you're only replicating with people that you can trust to respect that unpublished button? Like there's like this term called a tombstone in distributed systems where you don't just delete something, you mark it saying like, yeah, this is deleted forever and you can't undelete it ever again. So it's like, another thing I'd like to mention is, you know, you don't have to fully replicate everything in a distributed system. Or wait, no, that's slightly off topic, but yeah, like tombstones are, I think, very possible. Another thing is fewer things should be just explicitly public to everybody. Like Facebook posts that are just public to everybody, that's kind of weird. Also, if you like add a new contact, them seeing your entire life, I think that's kind of weird. And I think encryption is kind of like something we could apply to make that not a thing. Like, I think it's very underutilized. But also, when you move to decentralization and like distributed systems, your only privacy now is encryption. So on one hand, it's like scary, but on the other hand, it means that's a question you have to think about. So it's like, when I create this data, who can see it? And I think it's kind of on us as the people building applications to kind of give users informed understanding on being like, hey, this is available forever. Or maybe have a button being like, hey, this is available just to your friends, until you say, hey friends, please forget I ever did this. And somehow avoid the Streisand effect where now someone will be like, oh, Mauve didn't want me to see that ever again. I'm going to make sure to keep a copy because I'm a jerk.
Quick question. Is there any way that like things could just like automatically sound like, oh, this message self-destructs in 24 hours? Is that like a thing
So,
friends?
yeah, that's, so you could design something like that. You can do something like Snapchat, but actually real, rather than like, hey, we're gonna trust Snapchat to totally delete stuff and not share it with anyone, haha. But in the end, like cryptographically, you can't make self-destructive messages because of how information security works. At least not like by using the standard off-the-shelf stuff. Like maybe there's some new sci-fi technology that uses quantum entanglement that makes it like really one-time use, but it's like a trust thing. if you trust that everyone getting the data is going to respect that, then you're golden. But as soon as there's a malicious actor, it's not very nice. For instance, even in the Snapchat case, you know, it's like people can just screenshot your private photo. And even if you have the screenshot notification thing, they can just take another camera and take a picture and you wouldn't know. So information theory kind of makes all of this a bit of a pain in the butt, because in information theory, once something is out there, it's out there. Yeah, I'm not an information theorist though, and this is not informational advice. But yeah.
I think
Well,
it's something.
yeah, and trust changes over time too.
Yeah.
Like, you don't necessarily, there's so many circumstances of like, you know, I mean, marriage is one, and then divorce, like where you planned to spend the rest of your life together and then something messy happens and it becomes this whole thing where the person you trusted with your life and all of the things you own is now no longer worthy of that. Or just the simpler, like, sharing of pictures between loving partners who stop being loving partners and then one of them becomes a very bad actor. And our systems need to account for that.
It's really hard because of this whole like side channel thing. The closest we can get is make it hard, or like make software that behaves well and then hope that they don't. Like this is where centralization wins actually. If every time you wanted to access data, you have to go through a third party, access controls there are way better. That's not to say that someone accessing this third party can't save that data for later. It's just the default mode of interaction is through this arbiter. So yeah, it makes things a little more harder. But at the same time, I guess software that automatically locks you out could help too. I don't know. It's very hard.
Yeah, like I think, I guess maybe, am I interrupting you, Brendan? Okay. Well, anyway, like I think this also falls in with to most point, a bunch of this is about software design, but a bunch of it is also just fundamentally about trust, and how like none of these systems can actually remove trust. They just change where and how you do it, which is something Brendan and I talk about all the time, actually. In that, like it's a concern the degree to which in the D-Web and blockchain, et cetera, context, we spend a lot of time, or people spend a lot of time talking about not needing trust. But in fact, like the discussion like this kind of shows like how much even more critical it sort of is, because there's more parties involved and more pieces of trust you actually have to be concerned about from a certain conceptualization, because you're removing, in many situations, that kind of arbiter position, right? Where Facebook can be your arbiter for like whatever random post it is that you did. And as long as you trust Facebook to like be a fair arbiter, then Facebook can lock the other person out of something, theoretically delete it or whatever. And that also requires that you trust Facebook. But I mean, we can substitute in some other more trustworthy entity right now. It's just that there's not a lot of them around.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think it's very important to not ask our technology to do things that aren't possible. I don't know if you guys can hear me okay. But I'm currently saying things into a microphone that all of you are hearing. If I say something stupid, I can't unsay it. There's no back button on, and there's take backsies on the experiential world, right? And I think that's like sort of the end of the conversation when we talk about trust, right? Like, I've always been taught, like when you send an email, it's public. Like it's not, you may not think it's public, but it's public. Like there's nothing that stops from someone from turning around and sort of like disseminating that on forward. And that's, you know, and this is, I think what's so interesting is like we try to build protocols that sort of automate away the worst aspects of our society. But I think when we talk about, to try and sort of drag this back to the conversation of stewardship, I think there's a question here of how stewardship is a dynamic thing and how part of the awesome responsibility of being a steward is this sort of the discretion of the author, authorial intent, the desire to sort of have a commonly agreed upon system where the rules of the road are understood, like before the sort of like stewardship aspect begins, right? And because we talk about like, it's sort of embedded in this conversation where, oh, we should have a delete button on debt. We should have a way to transmit the desire to sort of delete something. That's presently not in the protocol, right? And so like, it's right now the thing we do, because it's not a slight on debt, it's just like, it's really hard to make, and there's lots of other things to make, and we have to, and like, it's just like it's prioritized on a given day. And I think as we sort of like are trying to get our heads around how stewardship functions, and how we move and disseminate the role of stewardship across these different sort of categories, it comes with new challenges, and it comes with, I think, problems that may not arise until much longer in the future. Like, and to sort of point to Kelsey's sort of temporal spacing and bucketing of the notion of stewardship, I think is a really interesting and very important aspect, right? You don't want a delete button right up until the second you really, really need a delete button, and you don't want all of your information shared through an encrypted sort of bidirectional happy protocol until the minute that you really realize that you need that thing. And I think that's just like that in itself, again, getting back to this idea of like, don't ask things that aren't possible. Like, it's actually not possible for us as protocol designers to get our heads around this stuff and think about all of these edge cases and corner cases now, right? And this is, but like, there's the whole history of like law and setting up governments and like trying to plan for stuff that you can't plan for. And I think that's sort of humbling, and hopefully speaks to the pressing need that Mauve sort of articulated to sort of break down some of these barriers between those who author protocols and those who consume protocols. For these reasons, I think it's sort of really incumbent on us to sort of put the effort for
Oh no.
Reliable, accurate, and useful metaphors. Hopefully I'm done. So hopefully I didn't lag out too hard.
Just a little bit, yeah.
If I-
Put the effort forward, and then we lost you for a couple seconds.
To translate, we got to put the effort forward to translate this stuff into useful metaphors for people. And that, I think that effort belongs squarely on the people authoring the protocol.
Well, I like that you brought up law, because I think a lot of tech people don't talk about law, especially in the distributed space. Because a thing I get a lot is people come up to me and they're like, okay, what if I publish copyrighted material on that? And I say, get sued. Like, if I create copyrighted, if I'm doing something illegal, I should be sued. And I think a lot of tech people think about exclusively in terms of like what is cryptographically possible or not possible. And I think they completely miss the whole social aspect of things. Like 100% the tech should have good defaults that make that reduce harm. But in the end, I think it's like societal pressures that should be kind of like pushed forward and like enabled. Like, how do we as a society figure out what is good and bad and do something about it? And how does technology kind of like not get in the way of that too much while maintaining some nice guarantees, like a balance. Like, I think the focusing on just the tech is not enough. And in fact, I think the tech is the least interesting part. Well, I mean, it's the most interesting for me because that's my specialty. I'm still very new to not tech. But I think like on a bigger scale, not tech is like the thing we should learn. Like, what are the cultural values, as was mentioned before, like the morals, like stewardship, like IPFS has Filecoin, which is like stewardship is in the protocol. You just publish your files and then the free market provides, and there's no human involvement really, which I think is one approach, but the alternative is like you have people agreeing socially on what to do, and I think that's like really important. So law. I think if someone, like a partner, has data that was supposed to be confidential and they're thinking of using it, they should get social repercussions. But also the tech should try to avoid that if possible. It's just like bad actors will always exist. And you can't, like, some things are mathematically impossible. And that's when you ditch math and you go for the club.
Okay. And respect for time. Kelsey, I saw your hand raised. Maybe you can kind of close things off for us. Kelsey?
Yeah, man, this has been a really cool conversation. I love where we started with the personal artifact moving forward, and the space. And I love that we moved through also the areas of what we're keeping, why we're keeping it, who we're keeping it for. And if I may, I'd like to close with a quote from a favorite Borgesian short story, which talks about the disappearance of data over time. This is called The Witness. And it says, "But something or an infinite number of things dies in every death, unless the universe is possessed of a memory, as the Theosophists have supposed. In the course of time, there was a day that closed the last eyes to see Christ. The battle of Junin and the love of Helen each died with the death of some one man. What will die with me when I die? What pitiful or perishable form will the world lose? The voice of Macedonio Fernandez? The image of a roan horse upon the vacant lot, Serrano and Charcas? A bar of sulfur in the drawer of a mahogany desk?" And I really liked bringing this back around to the idea of stewardship and remembering, as you were saying, the technology cannot solve every problem. There will be losses regardless, and some of it is the experiential, and some of it is the deeply personal, and some of it is the way that the data affected you or made you feel. And so it's really cool to hear everybody talking about different ways in which data is impacting them, and the ways in which we're thinking about what should go forward and what should be deleted, and maybe nothing should be deleted. But finding value and then remembering also that not everything gets saved. So the work that we're doing of trying to save what we can is all that we can do in some sense.
Okay. Thanks, Kelsey. That's a great way to not end the conversation, but leave us thinking more about the conversation. Continue this. I hope that was my last thing, but I hope people will think about how do we continue conversation? How do we continue being good stewards? How do we continue preserving what should be preserved or what we want to preserve, or allowing people to choose that choice themselves. And it is 4 o'clock. And I just want to thank everybody for being here. It was a really awesome conversation. And I think that's all.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so the next reading group, I think if I'm not mistaken, Kevin, is decentralization. And I am putting together the readings for that. Is that true?
Yeah, I'm so I'm thinking because the schedule has shifted so much, if you want to, because normally it would be you should have readings right now. And then
Yeah. I think if we
but
think about just delaying it 2 weeks, I can put together the readings in 2 weeks, and we can and by I mean I'm going to create the GitHub issue, tag everyone here, and pull it in. I've got some ideas. I think it would be really interesting. A couple of things that are jumping out at me, but this local first software notion and its relationship to decentralization seems really interesting. So yeah, I think it'd be really fun. So I'll create the issue. I'll tag everybody on this thing in it, and we'll see if we can't get something cool out of it. I think we can still pull off a great decentralization reading. It's home stretch. It's the easiest topic for all of us decentralization nerds. And so I think there's some fun ways we can take it. And I think it'd be really interesting to use local first as a foil for challenging some of our preconceived notions of decentralization as the rallying drum that we keep beating. So see if we can look at that. But yeah,
yeah.
cool.
I'll make make it flexible, and so whatever timeline, we'll just make it work.
Cool. All right. We'll have a look and we'll debate on issue. Yeah. So such a pleasure, everybody.
Have a good evening.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, Kelsey.
Bye.